Hi, I'm Alexandra Schwartz, and I'll be moderating tonight's conversation following Richard Flanagan's Arthur Miller Freedom to Write lecture. But first, a few notes about tonight's format. We're broadcasting on Crowdcast, and we want you to be part of the conversation. The chat is open for your comments, and PEN America staff will be sharing information to deepen your experience. If you have questions, add them to the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will take them later in the program. This event will be live captioned. Please see links in the chat for access. And we will provide periodic visual descriptions for visually impaired listeners in our audience. Right now, we are in a frame on the left side of the screen. We see branding for PEN America and the PEN World Voices Festival in the corners, and there is a chat with lots of comments on the side where people are telling us what they're watching, where they're watching from. Now let's turn our attention to the person of the hour, Richard Flanagan. He is a Tasmanian novelist and the author of more than 10 books, including The Narrow Road to the Deep North, which won the 2014 Man Booker Prize. His prolific writing and filmmaking span a tremendous range of issues and contexts, from Australia's history as a penal colony to the devastation modern industry poses to the environment and conservation today. I'm excited to speak with him tonight about his insights into the relationship between censorship, fear, and morality in this talk, as well as his newest novel, The Living Sea of Waking Dreams, which will be published in the US this week on May 25th. It's my honor to introduce Richard Flanagan sharing the 2021 Arthur Miller Lecture.
Thank you. It is strange to have as my subject freedom to write, coming from an island which, for a quarter of its modern history, was a slave society. Though there were major differences, the literature of the era abounds with comparisons between the convict society of Van Diemen's Land and the slave societies of the Americas. My forebears were transported as convicts from Ireland, frequently in the same ships and conditions to those which had transported Africans into American slavery, now plying the same trade with a different coloured cargo and a new destination where many of the same practices and even administrators of Caribbean slave colonies were deployed. My island's founding stigmata has a second wound, the near-successful genocide of the Tasmanian Aboriginal population. To this day, most Tasmanians are the descendants of the survivors of these two traumas. With Conradian exactitude, the war was called at the time a war of extermination. And this extermination, as many noticed then and later, extended to others, the Tasmanian emu, the Tasmanian tiger, as if it were necessary that some universe of wonder had to be obliterated to cloak the crime. And with it, memory was to be extirpated, enforced by silence. Things became unsayable, so many things. It may be as a species we are defined by our ability to forget, yet freedom only exists in the space of memory. I was born less than a mile from the plantation my great-great-grandfather was sent to work on as a convict labourer. Freedom to write was at the first step of freedom to think, to conceive of oneself as a free being, a thought over a century in forming. The freedom to write is the freedom to say the unsayable, and to say it I had to squeeze the convict blood out of myself, drop by drop, word by sentence, by book. In imagining how to do that, it was often to African American writers like Ralph Ellison, James Baldwin, and Toni Morrison I turned. I discovered my island in their world. I discovered I belonged both to my small island and to the universe of literature, and I learnt that I could not deny either without denying myself. To write, I had to be free, and to be free I had to write. That, for a writer, is the task, the only task, to be free. A writer's freedom is challenged by many things. In my country of Australia, the state has ever more repressive laws that significantly encroach on freedom of speech, while as our society grows more unequal, the richest and most powerful have the money to leverage grotesque libel laws to silence. In my country today, the practice of journalism is chilled by such acts as our Attorney General suing a reporter and our public broadcaster who alleged the anal rape of a minor by a senior unnamed politician. The Attorney General self-identified as the alleged rapist and on that basis instigated his legal action, which experts say has a good chance of success. But I want to talk today about another aspect of a writer's freedom. We are confronted with the title of this lecture with a question masquerading as an unremarkable truth. The freedom to write. But write what? Because what is at stake, what is always at stake, is finally not being free to write, but being free to write the unsayable, the thing not allowed to be said, to tear aside the shrouds of power and wealth and their accompanying conventions and orthodoxies to describe what is. Because in most places at most times, writers are free to write. We should not forget that tyrannies frequently reserve a higher, more privileged place for writers than democracies, a velvet prison that writers, for the most part, are happy to inhabit. They are free to write anything they like, as long as what they like to write is what power wants written and contents itself with saying the sayable. And therein lies the rub. Of the many pernicious fictions writers retail to themselves, and given the chance to others, perhaps the most ludicrous is that writers wish to write the truth. Of course, nothing is further from the truth than this lie. Encrusting the lie are comforting nonsenses, one of which writers are fond, is that the truth carries all before it. But truth mostly serves only to carry the truth teller to the abyss personally and quickly. Much as they may pretend otherwise, writers, as a rule, are not such fools as to not know this. The fatal problem of Camus' Meursault in The Stranger isn't that he killed another man, but that having killed another man, he can't lie about his reasons why, and so he is executed for telling the truth. This is both moving and comic, and therefore deeply moving. It is also profoundly unrealistic. We all lie about our reasons in order that we might live, and when the going gets rough, writers and artists generally roll over quicker than most. William Hazlitt, the 19th century journalist, once observed that for every tyrant born, so too are 1,000 men willing to be enslaved. We might add that of that 1,000, a disproportionate number will always be the artists and the writers. And how can it be otherwise? Each of our lives is a war between, on the one hand, our need to conform so that we might have shelter, food, and security, and on the other, the fundamental desire of our soul to be free. We understand both are necessary to us, but frequently also irreconcilable. Our lives are a walk through the rubble that results, our character the map of our journey. Another illusion writers treasure is that they are the voice of their people. This idea has a long history, given glorious tongue by Shelley with his injunction that poets were the unacknowledged legislators of the world. 100 years later, as nationalism became the new social organising principle, beckoning in a century of horror, Shelley's post-French Revolution global hopes had somewhat narrowed to Joyce's declaration that he would forge in the smithy of my soul the uncreated conscience of my race. Such monomania hides hubris. The unacknowledged legislator ends up purchased by power's lobbyist, while what emerged from the smithy is too often ideology's apologist. And for that reason, artists and writers are mostly not their people's heroes or heroines. Mostly they rub along with whatever is the new order, free to write as long as they write in certain ways about certain things. If seeking direction in a corrupted society, the hairdresser and plumber are more likely to serve as moral exemplars than the novelist and playwright. Klaus Mann, who in 1936 published Mephisto, an instructive novel on this theme, observed a few years earlier, as the Nazis' rise to power became irresistible, how many intellectuals and artists were crossing over to the Nazi side, not because they were sympathetic to Nazism, but because that's where they believed the energy and the future were. In an essay written in 1999, Roberto Bolaño describes how in Pinochet's Chile, a young woman with literary ambitions and her American husband, who worked for the Chilean secret police and perhaps the CIA, had a large house where she would hold literary soirees upstairs and he would torture political prisoners downstairs. Bolaño wonders in his essay if the writers remember the annoyance of the flickering current that made lamps blink and music stop, interrupting the dancing. Just as surely, he continues, they knew nothing about another parallel dance in which the jab of the prod tensed the tortured back of a knee in a voltaic arc. And this, concludes Bolaño, is how the literature of every country is built. The word literature, which with Bolaño always carried an ambiguous, even pejorative sense, here means writing that supports the parallel dance of horror, the literature that doesn't question, the literature of accepted orthodoxies. In America, you have your parallel dances, as we do here in Australia. We, the Aborigines who die in overwhelming numbers in custody, the refugees who we incarcerated in theatres of cruelty on remote Pacific islands. But acknowledging the parallel dances does not mean immediately writing only about them, for them, of them. To oppose the parallel dance is to oppose the orthodoxies of the age. It is the freedom to write not what we are told, but what we experience. And in that realm of experience must be the imagination and its capacious inventions. There must be fancy, the experience that is not authenticated in or by experience. There must be the tearing down of the border walls between I and you, me and us, a breach in the razor wire that separates one soul from the next. Penn's noble, necessary work over the best part of a century has been to battle the external constraints that stop a writer writing, and worse, which imprison and kill writers for what they have written and may yet write. But we live in a new age. We need to recognise new forms and new ways of censorship. The inner freedom to write what you think and what you feel, what you know and what you experience and what you imagine is always hard and is frequently the most difficult battle. But it grows harder. We live once more in censoring times, and what is confusing is that the new censors are not the state or state bodies. They are us. In the wake of 1989, we wrongly believed that material progress and human freedom were twins, that the former necessarily led to the latter. But as China so stunningly shows, you can have ever more material progress and ever less freedom. And we were blind to the erosion of our own freedom that our material progress and technological triumphs had brought in their wake. For a few short decades, we in the West thought we could now expect no censorship. But as we grew more unequal, as we found it within ourselves to see torture as acceptable, the persecution of refugees as necessary, that silence was a precondition of tolerance, we could not see that a corrosion of something fundamental was taking place. What is acceptable now is not ordered, but understood, conveyed by a nuance of new social prescriptions, enforced by a roll call of new profanities, new obscenities, new urgencies, new blasphemies, which we absorb as if by osmosis and call common sense, decency, respect, responsibility. Writing, though, should never pretend to respect or responsibility. Ever since the man from La Mancha put a toilet bowl on his head and strode out into the world in emulation of higher things, great literature has not been serious about the pieties and verities of its age. It has confronted cant and dogma with the absurdity of existence and laughed, questioning and upending them. Posterity, the blindest of fools, condescends to all who have gone before. Yet Cervantes, like Voltaire, laughed at religious faith and mocked rigidly held beliefs. Do we? The new prescriptions arise out of important and necessary social struggles. But in prosecuting causes and politics, writers are sometimes told to stay in their lanes. Writers who offered nuanced positions are attacked as the enemy they are not. Those who fail to observe the new road rules suffer opprobrium, shaming, and sometimes are called on to publicly repent. Of course, we have always wanted work that flatters our own stupidities. But this human weakness is vastly amplified and empowered by new technologies that are, in the final instance, unaccountable except to the profit and loss spreadsheets of the richest and most powerful corporations in human history. Many writers are, of course, happy to conform, and in conforming, condemn those who won't conform. They would, as Seamus Heaney had it about one of his millennia-old bog people, connive in civilised outrage, yet understand the exact and tribal, intimate revenge. This too is deeply human. And yet the exact and tribal, intimate revenge, turbocharged by the algorithms of greed, should not determine the fate of writers, nor should they be the metric by which writing is judged or created. The deeper damage is to the idea of writing itself, its capacity and desire for necessary invention, for the necessity of story and fancy, of its ability to encompass worlds to which neither the writer nor reader belong, and yet to which they find themselves profoundly joined. In this sense, the freedom to write is finally not so much a battle with the external forces, but the internal. It becomes a question of what was once called character or the soul. It would not be presumptuous to call it a spiritual battle. And in that battle, it constantly comes up against the dogmas of conformity. It is no revelation that nationalism led to many of the great disasters of the 20th century, and not just in literature. Before the Balkan Wars, the Slovenian poet Tomáš Salaman famously wrote, "I got tired of my tribe and moved out." These days, though, writers once again search for a tribe to move in with, as they once did with religion, and then empires, and then nations, and now identity. This change has deep and profound historical roots and consequences, perhaps the least, but for us the most, that of the great national novel giving way to the great identity novel. But if the tribes change, all tribes still finally demand tribal allegiances to belief and dogma that can leave a writer unfree to write what they believe. Salomon's point of view was of course doubly heretical, speaking out against both nationalism and the ruling Titoist ideology of his day. But it wasn't without antecedent. In post-revolutionary Russia, 1921, the first book to be banned in a peak of tribal dogma was Yevgeny Zamyatin's We, the novel from Orwell's 1984 on, for all the dystopias that followed and now litter our bookshops. Before he'd started We, Zamyatin observed, "He who has found his ideal today is, like Lot's wife, already turned into a pillar of salt and does not move ahead. The world is kept alive only by heretics, the heretic Christ, the heretic Copernicus, the heretic Tolstoy. Our symbol of faith is heresy." The fate of heretics is not, however, an easy one, as Zamyatin recognised 2 years after We was banned. "Heretics," he wrote, "are justly exterminated by fire, by axes, by words. It is just to chop off the head of a heretical literature that challenged dogma. This literature is harmful. But harmful literature is more useful than useful literature." Soon all that would be possible in Soviet Russia was to dedicate oneself, as Isaac Babel, in one of his best black jokes, told the Soviet Congress of Writers in 1934, to the literature of silence. And then head after head fell to Stalin's bullets, the heretic Isaac Babel's among them. We all write in the nightmare of the dark. We cannot escape our tribal impulse, our desire to conform, for their sources lies deep in our hearts as love and goodness, perhaps even deeper. But a novel, when it succeeds, takes the writer beyond their own history and character, escapes the shackles of their politics and opinions, and in the alchemy of story makes of the writer's soul that which joins one human being with all. In the end, novels, the great subversive medium, subvert not only what society thinks is right, but what the writer intends to write. Heresy allows a writer to write freely, for writing to be an act of joy that arises from the same deep place where laughter lives, countering the farce of dogma with the reality of life. And that joy, that laughter, that irreverence, that heretical impulse that begins with a toilet bowl astride a mad head is the only way to write when faced even with the most disturbing aspects of that reality, which today appear before us as the existential crisis of climate. The writer's challenge in the Anthropocene is finding a language that encompasses hope as well as grief. In meeting that challenge, writing must be the rising note heard over the long silence of orthodoxy, the single unsilenceable note that ascends. Such language needs to encompass hope not because of any earnest or worthy considerations, not as a morale booster in a dark time, but because as a species, it is hope that propels us forward. As individuals, it is hope that keeps us alive. Even in the lager, the inmates who lost hope were the despised. Any literature about matters of great darkness, such as the climate crisis, have to admit to that most human trait of life, hope, or they will be untrue to this most fundamental truth of who we are. "What will survive of us is love," wrote that gloomiest of poets, Philip Larkin, in his most enduring line, a line Larkin felt weak and rude writing. Perhaps for Larkin, the line suggested a mawkishness or sentimentality. Perhaps he felt it heretical to his harder, ossified aesthetics. But the line nevertheless outlived him, and it may ultimately be all that remains of his life's work. And what will survive of Larkin is a line that reads, "What will survive of us is love." Perhaps for any of us to write of hope, to write of love, we must learn once more to be free and embrace heresy. And for that to happen, we must every day write ourselves out of the literature of silence. We all come from something and equally need to be liberated from that same thing. That to me is the promise of literature, that I am not one, that I am not alone, that I am free. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard. You just touched on so many things that I've been thinking about when it comes to writing, and specifically the freedom to write. And thinking about this lecture and the idea of this Arthur Miller Freedom to Write lecture, the words that keep coming into my mind are who has the freedom to write, and who has the freedom to write what. And I think that's some of what you were starting to talk about. And one thing that just came to mind listening to you is that we're all writers now. It's so strange to live in a world in which everyone is a writer, in which so much spoken communication is writing, in which we're speaking to each other by writing our thoughts and our comments all the time. And as you say, the censor often is us. Who can write what? Who can put what into the public sphere? Who can say what? And I'm wondering, a little paradoxically, if I've just seen, for instance, in the American news that there's a bill in Florida to try to combat censorship on social media. People are upset that Donald Trump has been censored by Twitter, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm wondering if in this context, censorship can ever be a good thing.
Well, to me, the issue for me is the naivety around social media. The idea that it's some neutral town hall, as you would say in America, that it's some neutral public space. It's not. It's a place of material profit for a handful of corporations. And so whatever anyone says, whether it's Donald Trump or you at the New Yorker, it is amplified to the extent it makes money for these people. And these machines are monstrous in the way they're being developed, the way they're used, and in our naivety about the consequences of that. It's not that the machinery is good or bad. It is that it is being capitulated to a place where it has enormous power over all our conversations. And it determines the shape of those conversations. It becomes our thoughts without us being conscious that our thoughts and even our emotions are dictated by these grotesque machines of profit. And so I think when you talk about someone like Trump, I saw some figure a long time ago, a few years ago, how many million purportedly he was making Twitter every day. That's why he was a figure of such consequence. He made money for these companies. So I think to look at it narrowly as being about who's allowed, what's allowed, misses the point about our complete naivety of what's happening to every aspect, not just of our lives, but of our minds. The way, I think, as in the 19th century, you had this phenomena from the 17th to the 19th century of the common lands being enclosed and privatised by really the early capitalism. You've now got late capitalism seeking to enclose and privatise our very souls, and that to me seems not just disturbing, but terrifying, and the way so few people seem to care.
Yeah, I think maybe so few people seem to care because we have this impression of freedom, even as our freedom is being impinged on, as you say, by this money-making imperative. You know, for the censor to go from the state to the private corporation is I don't know which is worse, but we're in something of a dystopian time.
Yeah, I think it's what gets amplified and why it gets amplified and why it becomes the discourse, and why it then determines the fate of so many things, and it actually is shaping our culture outside of the net in very distorted ways, and that there should be more interest in that and more concern about that.
And for you as a writer of novels, of literature, have you felt these pressures change over the course of your career?
Well, to be a writer, it's always an unequal struggle. You're always, I mean, I was trying to allude to that in the lecture, that there are always dogmas and conformities, but I think we're very alert to the dogmas, conformity and censorship of the past, and we're blind to those in the present. So it's not that I feel any more oppressed or less oppressed, but I think they've changed, and we need to sort of see how they changed. And I think in literature, one of the ways it really manifests itself is that there's this cult of authenticity and experience, and that unless you can legitimize your writing through the authenticity of your lived experience, it has no validity as writing. And this to me seems a nonsense, and it completely denies the fact of imagination, not just in the creative life, but in human life generally. It's led to this explosion in autofiction, memoir, whatever you want to call it. Now, the best of that is terrific writing, and it's always existed from St. Augustine on. But, you know, I do meet a lot of writers now who feel that is not for them to venture beyond it because they are not qualified somehow, you know, to write about other things. Everything else comes with prescriptions. And this to me seems to be, you know, sort of a sickness at the moment, and an idiocy. You know, because you know what you have with the invention of story is you have the capacity to speak to what you don't know. You have the capacity to escape your own the limits of your own experience and character, to go beyond your own bigotries and smallness, and to create something that is much larger, that speaks of and to others. That's the power of story. And when you write story too, you are writing an entertainment, but you're writing an entertainment that is also a profound intellectual, aesthetic, and spiritual tradition in the form of the novel that actually continues to ask questions that we have no other form capable of asking. So it still does things that nothing else does for us in the same way. So I think this new idea that only writing rooted in an authentic experience is sort of crazy. And it also demands of people that they put all this work into creating an experience which is largely false to justify the book which they claim to be true. It's a crazy sort of paradox, isn't it? You know.
Well, this is making me wonder about something in your new book, The Living Sea of Waking Dreams, which I know certainly the Americans in the audience will not have yet had a chance to read, though they will soon. But you have a character in your novel who begins to lose pieces of her body. First her finger disappears and isn't there, and then other pieces of her body begin to go. So, you know, in writing a character like that, were you trying to draw attention to the beautiful artificiality of fiction, to something that couldn't be your own lived experience. You're certainly not going to lose a finger in a magical vanishing. Was there a certain desire you had to go back to the traditions of magical realism, or even before, to highlight fiction's fictionality?
Well, I think magical realism was a very specific moment in the history of literature. What it did was the novel had become very tight. That the modernist novel was sort of losing a lot of its creative power, and it was losing, that became ever more about composition, style, technique, a certain sort of psychological veracity, but it was becoming sclerotic. What the magical realist did was reconnect the novel to much older traditions of storytelling, the fabulous, the fairy tale, the way in which the least realistic way of describing reality is realism. The recognition that reality is always marvelous and extraordinary. So, it intrigued me that many people feel in this day and age, particularly older women, that they vanish, that parts of them cease to be seen, and that vanishing becomes accelerated as they age, and devices like simply having limbs vanish is just a way of using story to suggest other things. But to be honest, I don't think about it much, I don't consciously think this will serve this or that purpose. If it seems to work as story, and then I use it. And the thing I've learned as a writer, I knew a lot about writing before I wrote any books, and the more books I've written, the less I realise I know. But what I have discovered is that novels come alive in that communion between the reader and the book. And if they like the book, they invest your sorry sentences and poor inventions with the whole authority of their life, with their histories and their soul. And at that point, the book becomes something else entirely, and it lives. And for that to happen, the less you tell the reader what to think, the more you just allow the invention of story to suggest, the more powerful your work tends to be, and certainly the better chance it has of connecting with readers.
I just want to take a second before we continue our conversation to encourage anyone who has questions, send them to the chat, and I'll ask some coming up. So any questions you've been holding on to, send them. So your novel deals with climate change, and I think, tell me if I'm wrong, but I think you wrote it during the fires in Australia last year. Do I have that right?
Yeah, you do. What happened was that we had terrible fires in Tasmania the year before, the mega fires in Australia, and the fires in Tasmania were unprecedented. They actually started in our rainforests, and so they were a harbinger. They shocked everyone because the magnitude of them, the nature of them, everything about them was profoundly different. And I began the book then, and I realised, looking at the weather patterns, that almost certainly the next summer would see the same pattern repeated in mainland Australia, but on an immense and catastrophic level. And so I sketched the novel out, and sorry. I sketched the novel out, and with the aim of rewriting it in real time through that dreadful black summer that Australia then experienced, because I wanted to infuse it with whatever the emotion of that time was. I sketched it out during the Tasmanian fires and the wake up, but then I completely rewrote it with that strange urgency and horror that beset Australia when so much of what we'd taken for granted suddenly looked not eternal, not given, but fragile transitory, and a new future was coming to us, and it was a very, very frightening future.
Yeah, you know, and one thing I was wondering is you're dealing with something like climate change, which is affecting us all and is affecting the entire globe, and itself has a very strange relationship to fiction, because you have a certain political group calling it fiction, even though it's very real, and you turn to fiction in order to make it real to us. And you do that through the world of the family. Your novel is really about a family. It's about a mother who's dying and three of her children who want to keep her adult children who want to keep her alive. And I was wondering why you decided to locate that global story of climate change inside this metaphor of one particular small family.
Well, the family's hopefully not a metaphor. Hopefully it's a family. And
yes, always correct the critics' overinterpretation, please. I should encourage that.
Well, as I was saying earlier, like you know, if you try and construct your novels in that sense, you fail. When I began writing, I wrote in the modernist tradition that I read. I wrote crowds and cities. I'd never been in the city. I'd never seen a crowd. The first crowd I saw was in London when I was about 24, and I had a panic attack. I was terrified of it. You know, you have to write out of, you know, what you have. The point of the family, I guess, it was really about. It's about a middle-aged woman who is terrified she's never lived, and therefore she cannot allow her mother to die, and she subjects her mother to this terrible physical degradation, where the mother's no longer living, but nor is she dead. She's just in the state of prolonged dying. And it seems to me that so many of us have a terror of living, and we have a terror of accepting what the beauty and wonder that's there in front of us, but it is immediate. It's what we touch, it's what we see, and we're constantly blinded to it. I mean, it is, you know, one of the things I really noticed when I first started writing, and I was very influenced by European American models, but I noticed always there's this idea of being alone, that ultimately the character, like Kafka's Cave, dies like a dog alone. Chekhov, you live alone and you die alone. I mean, it's just repeated ad infinitum. That's not the sense I ever had growing up here. You know, I had a sense that you exist in others, and only in others is there meaning. And when I allowed that to take hold of my writing, I was finally able to write something that had some worth, you know, because that is how people view things here. It's fundamentally different.
Mm-hmm.
That didn't really answer your question. I'm sorry.
That's why it's a conversation and not a questionnaire.
Yeah.
If this is about the freedom to write, you also have to have the freedom to talk, in my opinion.
Thank you.
Well, I'm still thinking about climate change, and, you know, as a subject for fiction, it seems so challenging to me, because it is a subject that, at least it feels like the whole world is talking about and thinking about and writing about, and yet why can't we take action? And I'm wondering if you think that literary writers, really have an obligation to write about climate change and, you know, and other enormous social subjects, or even if an obligation exists on writers of, you know, contemporary writers to address certain subjects.
No, I don't think writers have any obligation to write about anything except what they wish to write about. I mean, often the writers who are most politically engaged write the trashiest things, and the writers who are least engaged actually write the things that are most telling. You know, you think of Kafka on that most momentous day in his life when World War I was declared, and in his diary he writes something like, morning, war declared, afternoon, went for a swim. I mean, that's a personal sense of proportion. And yet, in many ways, you could say his novels speak more accurately to the strangeness, to the horror, to the complexity of the 20th century than all the politically engaged writers. So no, I don't think that any obligation exists. I think writers, writing has to exist. I mean, this is another idea that you see more and more strongly now, that writing has to be political, but it doesn't. Life isn't political. Politics is an aspect of life, but it's only an aspect. And I think there's a cult of power at the moment, this idea that, and I think it comes from the way the market took over from the 90s on, and everything became transactional. So there's an idea that someone has power and I don't have it, therefore the only way I can get power is to destroy their power. If you think about it, that's a sort of quite a strange and ridiculous idea, isn't it? I mean, it makes no sense at all. So I think this idea of politics, of power, of all these things, as though they're at the forefront of life, they're not at the forefront of life. It's just it's another dogma that we need to see beyond. So no, I'm not for political writing. I mean, the great thing about novels when they succeed is that nothing is more secondary to them than the author's intention. And sometimes you see novels that an author set out to write something political, but luckily the novels escape them and become much more powerful in consequence.
Mm-hmm. All right, we have an audience question, and it's from a fellow writer, Tochi Anyabuchi, a name I'm happy to see pop up in the chat. And he asks, could you speak to any situations of censorship you may have encountered baked into the structural pipelines or architecture of Anglo-American publishing and journalism, and how they might be combated? Do you need me to repeat the question? It's
I don't have enough familiarity. I could generalise, but I'd be generalising, and there would be people who could come up with counter examples. I know in my country for a long time what was very difficult to publish was works by Indigenous writers. Mm-hmm. It's changing a lot now. They're becoming celebrated, they're becoming popular, but that was a sort of an area that no one really wished to touch for a long time. But I can't speak more generally. I mean, the reality of publishing is most of the time, most of it is dross, but you just have to be grateful for when good works get through. I don't know. I mean, I follow the debates in America and a little, and hopefully it's changing for the better.
Yeah, I think what Tochi's question makes me think of is how so much gatekeeping has taken place in at least American publishing, and I'm sure the situation is similar elsewhere, to prevent, as you say, in Australia, for instance, Indigenous voices, and in the United States, Indigenous voices, Black voices, voices of color, and it's almost as if that has created this premium now that some of those gates are finally coming down on writing about identity, which is leading further to it's almost a paradoxical narrowing, as you described it, an effort to get free that's leading to more restraints on what people should write or can write.
I mean, the problem with publishing everywhere is that publishing knows only what publishing knows, and it's the new that's always difficult for publishing, because no one knows if it'll sell, and everyone can find a precedent where it didn't sell. And whereas when you when you can point to the bestseller, they'll happily follow in that wake. The other problem is that publishing's relentlessly metropolitan, and writing frequently comes from the edges, socially, geographically, and so on. And so that they're actually very separate cultures rather than the single culture people assume them to be.
We have to go in a few minutes, but I have another question. Maybe it will be the final question. We'll see how we do in timing. But I would forgive you if it was too daunting a question to answer. Or maybe I'm just flattering myself here. We'll find out. But you talk about how we've become the censors. You mentioned that in your lecture. That really strikes me, and I think that's true. I think in some ways the reason we've become the censors is because of a failure of institutions of power and capital to free us, to free our speech. We're trying to regulate, almost over-regulate in real time. But you also in your lecture talked, you referred in your own way to, I think, the Isaac Babel quote of squeezing the slave out of myself drop by drop. And it seems to me that we might have to squeeze the censor out of ourselves drop by drop as well. And I'm wondering how we do that. Is that something that you have had to combat in your own life? How do you squeeze the censor out drop by drop?
Well, I think by exactly that. I think that's the battle you face sentence by sentence, day by day. It's always, I've got a wonderful editor who I've worked with for over a quarter of a century, Nikki Christa. And the things she always strikes out in my work first are the things I know are derivative. And I know where they've come from. And that always goes first. And I think it's, I think that's the constant battle for every writer it's something you must be conscious of. And it's something you must struggle with day after day, page after page. And I don't think there's any rule or method, but there should be the desire, that's I think, what was it Chekhov said, the writer should be in the dock with the guilty. You should always remember what your point of view is.
Well, thank you so much, Richard. This has been a fantastic lecture and conversation. And I know if we could hear the applause, it would be thunderous.
Oh, that's very kind. My coughing was the only thunderous thing, unfortunately.
And to the audience, I will say we thank you all for joining us. The Penn World Voices Festival isn't over, so visit penn.org/festival to hear more from your favorite authors. Have a great night.
Thank you, Alexandra.